So the first thing you need to establish with these half angle formulas really is that angle itself. So what this tells us is that 15 degrees is that alpha over 2, right? That's that half angle formula. This portion right here is alpha over 2. So that means that 30 degrees is what we're using for alpha. Okay, so this is actually what's going to go into your function or your formula, not the 15. So this is equal to plus or minus 1 minus cosine of 30 divided by 2. Now, as far as the plus or minus goes, I'm using the 15 to make that decision because that's what we're actually doing our computing with, right? Okay, so 15 lives in quadrant 1, right? Which means that ultimately we're working with a positive angle, okay? So we are not going to use the negative sign on this one. So this gives you square root. You can write positive in front if you want, but you don't have to. 1 minus, now what is cosine of 30, right? So again, you can use your left hand rule. We don't really need a reference angle for this because this is what we would have used as a reference angle anyway. But this is the square root of 3 over 2 over 2. Make sure that denominator root 2 is inside of your radical. A lot of times I see the radical kind of end with that numerator, and it needs to go all the way down to include that too. Okay, so within your radical, you're going to get a common denominator, right? So times 2 times 2. So you're going to get the square root 2 minus square root 3 over 2 over 2, right? So this gives you 2 minus square root 3 over 2 times 1/2, right? Times the reciprocal, 2 minus root 3 over 4. Now, this is still ultimately a radical, and we have, it's called the quotient property of radicals, which means that that radical applies to each the numerator and the denominator. So you should always make sure that denominator is rationalized. And yes, you do need to do the rewrite like this. So your final answer, lucky for us, square root of 4 does simplify very cleanly. You get the square root of 2 minus the square root of 3 all over 2. Okay, that's your final answer. It doesn't hurt to check it in a calculator if you want, but you don't really have to. Okay, so let's try the same thing with cosine down here. I might need some more space. But let's try the same thing with cosine. So again, we want to identify this right here is your angle, but this is alpha over 2, right? So we want to multiply this 22.5 times the 2 so that we have alpha is 45 degrees, right? For a lot of these questions, I mean, not always, but for a decent handful of them, when they're written like this, you do end up with something relatively nice to work with. So you're looking at plus or minus the square root 1 plus cosine of 45 degrees divided by 2. Now we need to be conscious of a couple of signs, as I mentioned before, plus or minus signs. One sign we need to be aware of is alpha, right? This is in quadrant 1, so it's a positive value. So again, we are going to emphasize the positive part of our answer, okay? The other thing I actually do need to be aware of, and I didn't really mention this in the first part, but the other thing I need to be aware of is what is the plus or minus sign of cosine of 45 degrees, right? Because when I simplify that, I need to know if that output is a positive or a negative number. Very often, not in this case, but very often, alpha and alpha over 2 do not live in the same quadrant, so they actually might have different signs. So again, we'll acknowledge this output is positive, so that when we plug it in, this right here is a positive number as well. And we'll get to examples where that's not really the case. So this gives us, again, you can put plus, you don't absolutely need it. 1 plus cosine of 45 degrees is root 2 over 2 over 2. So we saw this in the last question as well. You need a common denominator so that we can write this as 2 plus the square root of 2 over 2 over 2 in a square root. So this gives us 2 plus root 2 over 2 times a half in a square root, which gives us 2 plus root 2 over 4, which again, you go one more step to clean up. 2 plus root 2 square rooted over 2. Okay, and again, that's an exact value. That's why this is useful to us. It's beyond just throwing it on a calculator and getting a decimal approximation. Okay, one more to go.